So here is the talk that sort of capstone for all of my recent talks at Black Hat and DEF CON, where I've been talking about vulnerabilities in penetration testing systems and processes, some of the weaknesses that have been introduced by common practices and things that are in people's trainings and books and things like that, things that become habit that wind up being vulnerable. The purpose for this talk is to talk about how do we build a secure penetration testing program, how do we introduce some discipline into the profession and practice of penetration testing, how do you manage a team that should be doing this securely, and so what questions do you have to ask? So in light of these vulnerable tools, practices, and trainings that I've covered in previous talks and hostile network environments, the idea is to come up with a set of comprehensive recommendations for conducting secure, offense-oriented engagements. And that's a blanket term for a lot of different things. Penetration tests, red teaming, even application security tests, anything where you're breaking things, right? Anything where you're launching potentially unsafe code against something that's potentially vulnerable, which might put it in a potentially unsecure state for a third party to find. My background, chances are if you chose this talk over the Mac malware talk, you might know who I am, but the background here is that my whole career has been focused on offense, breaking things. Helped build a cybersecurity program at Mississippi State University, did research on vulnerabilities in SCADA HMI systems, and then went from there to looking at embedded systems that are used for penetration testing, pwn plugs, Wi-Fi pineapples, things of that nature. And then branching out from there and looking at general practices and tools that are used across the industry. In that process, I moved from being a professor at Mississippi State to being a director of cyber operations at our company, Horn Cyber, where we do these sorts of services. My previous talks on the topic, the relevant ones being DEF CON 21, 23, and 24 with Black Hat USA 2016, where I looked at vulnerabilities in the pwn plug, the Wi-Fi pineapple, other tools that have insecure, unencrypted command and control, and then also looking at training programs and seeing how some of the most common training programs in this field teach insecure practices such as unencrypted netcat shells, using open relays in other countries to route penetration tests through, weird stuff like that. Very interesting reading on some of that. The motivation for this work is that penetration testers are attractive targets. They have a level of access to their client systems that might even exceed most of the network admin staff. If you have a network that's administered by a group of people and they have, very rarely do you see a network where it's well segmented on responsibilities, but if you have several different admins with different levels of privilege, well, the pen tester comes in and generally gains access to all of those, and so you have one person or one group that has full control over that entire network for some period of time, and that's not unusual, that's more common than not. And so they have information on their clients that's valuable, and there's information about the penetration testers themselves that's valuable. A good penetration testing firm is going to have some secret sauce, right? They're going to have their own intellectual property for tools that they use, automation processes, and even zero-day exploits for things sometimes. And all the infrastructure that supports this type of testing has lots of vulnerabilities in it because it's developed ad hoc. A lot of it is developed as proof of concepts. A lot of engagements involve the use of proof of concept exploits that have not been subject to very stringent software engineering practices. So the tools and procedures and the training that we give people lend those engagements to being something that can be compromised. So if you look at this, you have to think of this in terms of what are an attacker's capabilities? What's our threat model, for lack of a better term, for this? So are we talking, is this something that's going to happen on every engagement, that you're going to be faced with some nefarious third party that's going to be attacking your infrastructure, attacking your testing procedures during the test? Well, In some cases, yeah. So not every engagement, but there's a lot of engagements where we wind up finding other attackers on the systems as we're breaking into them. We're not the first ones there, for example. And so some of that might be a setup, right? And honestly, if you think about it in terms of the value of the information, some pretty advanced actors would benefit by compromising a penetration tester or the client of a penetration tester and trying to move back into the tester from that. And so when we talk about the types of vulnerabilities that are scary in this sense, sometimes man-in-the-middle attacks are dismissed as being something that you need some setup and some planning and some good network position to execute. The sophistication, skill, and resources of an attacker that would be interested in doing this would not have a problem executing man-in-the-middle attacks. In every one of your engagements as a penetration tester, if you find a protocol that you can ARP spoof and get into or otherwise man-in-the-middle, you do it and you put it in there as a finding. And so if it's a finding on the client's network, it should be a finding in your infrastructure as well. And so the victimology of this is an attacker might compromise the penetration tester directly through the tools that they're using. So, for example, we accidentally did this once. We left a payload on a system. It didn't execute on that system, but one of the client's penetration testers found it, moved it to his workstation, and was playing around with it, ran it, and suddenly a shell shows up from his workstation to us, right? And so stuff happens, right? You're naturally running a lot of code that maybe you didn't completely vet. It may come in through a client system back to your infrastructure. And so once that penetration tester is compromised and some foothold has been reached there, then the natural instinct there is to move along through multiple engagements. And so if you're not, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but if you're not cleaning up your pen test appliance that you ship out or your workstations that you're working from between engagements, then anything that compromises that system and persists is going to compromise and persist across all of those engagements. And so there's a lot of bang for your buck in hacking a pen tester, assuming that they're doing good business, right? And so this is a form of operational security. And so anytime we talk about operational security, all we're doing is quoting the Gruck over and over again. And so if anything I say on that contradicts the Gruck, just go with what he's saying. But the idea is we're looking at literally the security of the operation. And you can think of each engagement as a separate operation, or each part of an engagement as an operation. And so the question is what's the information involved? Like what would be the target? And who are the parties involved, and how are they going to communicate with each other? And so if we're going to address this, we look at how do you address operational security. If you look at NSA guidelines, IID's guidelines for operational security, there's 5 steps to it, and they're surprisingly relevant to this. It's to identify the critical information, analyze the threat, analyze the vulnerabilities, assess the risk, so is this something to be concerned about, and apply the appropriate countermeasures. Much of this is also communication security, just simply getting a secure channel put in place such that you can run all your crazy tools over it. And so talking about team qualifications for this, on the offense, on the criminal side of this, it's very simple. Script kiddie is less than elite hacker, and there's a basis for measuring technical skill as to be able to break into a system or not. But in this profession, we know that alphabet soup is bad. We know that having this email signature line with all your certifications listed out is probably a bad sign for a pen tester, but we don't really have a way of measuring somebody better than that. And so the current state of this isn't good enough. There's no natural tendency towards good engagement operational security. There's nothing to say that somebody follows that. There's no training right now that covers it until Friday at my DEF CON workshop that's already sold out. So. And then there's foundational knowledge that's skipped. You have these, and this is not necessarily bad. These terms are not necessarily bad in something, but if you see them, start thinking. If you see something that's for dummies or 101 or boot camp or something like that, ask yourself, what are they compromising in order to teach you how to do this? Are they doing it? Are they doing you a disservice by not covering some of the fundamental issues here, which might be good application security stuff, the fundamentals of how a vulnerability works and how an exploit takes advantage of it? And so what you wind up here is with testers that can't build. And so some percentage of your testers should be able to build as well. Frankly, all of them should be able to. If you're not able to design the system, then you're probably a poor choice for actually trying to attack it. So how do you raise the bar on this? Well, the first thing is to say no to skipping the fundamentals, and say no to skipping the background. Pen testing automated is easy, but hacking is hard, right? And so it's easy to use the tools that are out there for penetration testing, but it's hard to do a pen test because those tools are not going to take you the entire way. And that's true for all aspects of this, not just the security of the test. And so you have a balance here, problem between qualifications and skills crisis here. Is like you're looking for higher skilled people, but you're honestly having to settle for what you can get to fill up a team. And so that's a challenge there. And there's a lot of challenges in this deck that I don't have complete solutions for. And so everybody thinks of a computer as a magic box, and you stop at some level of abstraction that you understand. You're either a user, a programmer at a high-level language, an assembly language programmer, flipping bits on the hardware, soldering wires and transistors together. At some point, you stop, and everything below that is magical to you. You don't understand it, but you understand it well enough. You have an abstraction of it in your head that helps you understand it. But all the bugs that are out there involve a misunderstanding of how the magic box works, or the magic box itself doesn't work like it's supposed to. And so that's how you have to find these things. And so it pays to have that development experience and programming experience and low-level experience. So you must be able to understand published vulnerability information, to include that of pen testing tools themselves, evaluate software for trust. So if you're going to use this email scraper to do your open source intelligence gathering, if it's written in C and it's scraping HTML web pages with a crazy parser, maybe that's not so trustworthy compared to something that's written in a higher level language that's better memory safe operations. And understand the impact of those tools on client systems and test those impacts, right? And so can you tell me what that program can do to the target system? So you have to have proficiency in programming, platforms, networking, and your education has to go beyond 1-week courses. Whether it's a formal, degree program, or you simply get all the books and you self-study, it doesn't matter, right? As long as you get that fundamental knowledge in there. And so the recommendation is that building a secure penetration test requires a team with higher qualifications than to do one without. And so vulnerability analysis, in-shop vulnerability analysis. Why would you do it yourself? And the reason why you would do this vulnerability analysis of your own tools yourself is either A, they're custom to your environment, or they're custom to pen testing and nobody's really looked at them yet. And so vulnerabilities start falling out of niche software that nobody's looked at. It's harder to find vulnerabilities in Windows and Internet Explorer and things like that because there's so many mitigations in place. You've got so many smart people looking at them. But if you pick a piece of software that only a subset of the subset of the subset of InfoSec people use, chances are nobody else has looked at it yet. And so the idea is to put eyes on this software. And so there's a big difference there in the amount of interest that goes to it. And so vulnerability analysis has to be undertaken to identify these vulnerabilities. And you may have to do it yourself for now. And you have to be able to do some impact estimation. So we talked about how a tool impacts a system. What's its effect on that system? Does it destabilize it? Does it put it into an insecure state? Am I going to come in on a pen test and 8 months later and find that the previous penetration tester left the shell wide open for that entire time? And who knows what happened in that time period between it? Did he even do it on purpose or by accident, right? And so understanding the impact of your tests on the system means, does the exploitation process leave the system being attacked more vulnerable immediately? So have you immediately taken down some restrictions, like you've jailbroken something and now it doesn't have any mitigations in place? Or now everybody's a root user, that sort of thing. Have you disabled that security? And does the continuous process of command and control of that compromised system leave the system or its data vulnerable? So how do you communicate with that system? How do you control it? And so is there a layer of encryption there? How hard is it to get into between that system? And then finally, can changes impact security be reverted by the tester? So can you clean up the system that you break into? Sometimes it's hard to. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you wind up breaking into something and you don't have the permissions to unbreak it because you never got to root, but you impacted something that only root can fix. And so you have to have a process in place to communicate with the client and their staff about reverting that thing back and kind of go into them hat in hand with, what, we broke this thing, sorry, but we need to let you know about it now before somebody else breaks the thing. And so team members should have that capability to assess and test the impact of their exploitation tools and procedures. They need to be able to understand what's going to happen when they run this thing and what can they undo, what can't they undo. And it's going to have to define how your engagement rolls too. Are you going to allow that system to remain vulnerable through the engagement? Layering security. So this is basically just applying multiple aspects of this to the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem of this is very difficult. One of the challenges of this is that you'll never fully solve this problem because you're inherently making a system that wasn't supposed to run the code you're supposed to run. You're wanting it to run that code. You're exploiting that weird machine, and it's going off, and you don't have complete control over it, and it doesn't have complete control over itself. And so, at some point, that system is vulnerable in the state that it's sitting in there, and you just have to do the best you can to keep it from being more vulnerable through your testing. And so, tunneling insecure tools and protocols securely, using these best practices and standard operating procedures that I've discussed in this and we'll discuss in the workshop. The workshop will have all of its materials available after Friday as well. So even if you're not able to make it, you'll be able to get a hold of all that. The ability to analyze one's own tool chain, human oversight, and so there has to be policy and procedure there for somebody like me who manages a set of pen test teams to look at what the testing teams are doing and see that they're doing it right. Or if it's out of scope of what we normally do, standard operating procedures, they can come back to me and ask me for an exception in this case, and we'll talk through, is this an appropriate thing to do on this engagement with this client, and communicate that risk to them. And so it benefits from defense in depth. That's not surprising for us. How do we deal with client data and tester intellectual property at rest, in transit, and how do we retain it? And so at rest meaning on the systems themselves and on our systems during the engagement. Do we have multiple clients' data on the same systems while we're doing our engagements? Do we securely transport it? Hopefully with our tunneling and our layering of security, that's not as much of an issue. But after the engagement, how long are you going to retain that data? You may just, if you're like me, you just want to ditch it as soon as possible, right? But if you're going to have multiple engagements with this client, you've got to decide what information is important to keep from this engagement to the one 6 months from now. Are you going to just keep the scans? Or are you going to keep the loot? Probably not. But you may keep some of the host discovery information just so that you have some baseline. And you're always more than likely going to keep your reports around unless there's some agreement to destroy those. And that's all the good stuff anyways, right? So sensitive data should be encrypted in transit and at rest, and you have to have some sort of data retention policy that your client understands. Getting the client involved is important with this. Your job is to illustrate, your job as a penetration tester is to illustrate risk explicitly by showing them this is the bad thing that can happen to you. Threat, vulnerability, and impact, right? And so communicating the risks of your testing and the measures that you put in place to reduce it is good. Like, be honest with it. Talk about, the nature of this sort of tool and the nature of how tools that we use can destabilize systems. But this is how we make it better, right? This is how we keep an eye on it. We have humans doing the testing instead of just pushing the button and walking off. There's some things that we will do unattended. There's some things that we won't do unattended, right? And letting the client know about those policies will put them at ease and help them understand, and also raise the bar for everybody in this field so that the expectations for better penetration tests are there. And so you want to address things like knocking over systems. You can't avoid it sometimes. Came across some door lock controllers a few months ago where if you send a simple web request to the web interface, it had a web API on it, but if you just requested the root page, you had to reboot the device. That's all. That was it. It was done, right? And so how do you avoid that? Well, you're not going to realistically be able to avoid doing that to at least one of them, right? And so you have to let the client know that that's a possibility. How do you communicate with your client? How do you send those reports to the client? You want the client to be good with PGP and communicate with Signal and Tor and all that and everything. And you want them to have all the good secret squirrel security stuff that we use for communicating with each other. But the reality is, you're just going to have to deliver it to them in a web portal with SSL so that they can log in and get that file with some reasonable amount of security. So open communication has to flow. When we're scoping these engagements, the idea is, do we include the fragile systems? Do we avoid denial of service? We usually do on that. So the breadth, depth, and rules of engagement for a pen test should consider the security of performing that test on a client organization's systems. Standard operating procedures, boring. You want to have some stuff in place for your testers, right? You want to have, when your testers, for example, create accounts on a target system, how do they go about doing that? Are they always using root, or pentester, horn cyber, or obscene things sometimes? Are they going to reuse those passwords? It's probably no good. You need to have a centralized store of passwords that are of accounts that were created on the systems so that they're not compromised again in the course of the engagement. The team leader needs to be aware when those accounts are made, especially if that account can't be deleted by anybody but the sysadmin staff. And so client notification of forced password changes. We log into a system, it makes us change the password. We don't want to leave it in a bad state, so we change it to something known and let the client know. So you have to have a cleanup phase there where you clean up everything you can and you let this client know about the stuff that you can't. And so those standard operating procedures, they're there to guide an engagement, but it's not meant to inhibit the creativity of the pen tester, because if you do that, then you're no good with a pen test anymore. That's not a pen test anymore. And so what you're having to do is you're having something where if they go outside of that scope, they have to talk to somebody else. They have to get a second opinion on it. They have to get approval for it. And it gives a little bit of discipline to the engagement. And then postmortems. Are you going to discuss the engagement post-mortem with your team? Are they going to discuss where they think there may be some problems with the way that we're testing, whether it's security related or not? And are you going to empower them to then take on research projects to fix those things? And by making the team own those things, you're going to improve your team morale as well. So the challenges for this, it's the nature of exploitation. It's a destructive process in most circumstances. It's functionality, it's additional, unintended, and often unrestricted. That's your weird machine definition of a vulnerability. And so there's no guarantee that an exploit in this sense will establish secure communication. And I'm running out of time here, so I will skip to the good stuff. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to avoid impacting the agility of a test while still conducting that test securely. And so with that, I've got a white paper on this topic that should be in with the Black Hat materials. There will be materials for a 4-hour workshop with exercises and VMs and more guidelines available later on in the week. So thank you very much, and I believe we'll be taking questions to the breakout room. All right.